Good morning, Senior Pride here. I'm going to discuss an issue that is important to Canadians, but also relates to everyone in the world because we are kind of switching to these right-wing, more authoritarian regimes, and that is what is happening in Canada. Currently, in government, our head of the Canadian government are the Liberal Party, which have kind of shifted to the right over the years and have become kind of I call them conservative light, but other people have other names for them. The reality is that there will be an election, and it will likely be soon, and it is very likely that Pierre Poilievre and the Progressive Conservative Party will become our leaders. So there are some potential challenges for human rights with this. Now, it's important to note that Canada globally is recognized as a defender of human rights, that we have a commitment to equality, justice, individual freedoms, and this is anchored in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a cornerstone of our country's legal and social framework. However, with shifting party ideologies and the Progressive Conservative Party they used to be fiscally conservative, but now they're becoming socially conservative. We're seeing an ideology that is actually, emphasizes individual liberties over group liberties, over community. So we're seeing growing disparities in healthcare, housing, gender equality, and protection for marginalized communities. And a progressive conservative government could bring even more changes in this negative direction. Now, past conservative governments have been associated with austerity measures, limited expansion of social programs, and policies prioritizing economic growth over equity. And because of this, there are concerns being raised about how the party's governance could impact issues such as Indigenous rights, women's rights, LGBT plus rights, immigration, and the rights of persons with disabilities. So, for a historical context, the Progressive Conservative Party has a mixed record on human rights, and there's this kind of tension between economic priorities and social progress. Now, historically, conservative governments have actually taken steps towards advancing human rights, and we look back at John Diefenbaker's landmark Bill of Rights in 1960. But these gains have been overshadowed by priorities that focus on fiscal austerity and undermine social safety nets and marginalize vulnerable communities, such as the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. So, for example, Brian Mulroney in the 1980s and 90s emphasized free market principles and deregulation, and that kind of exacerbated the economic inequality that exists so blatantly in Canada today. Mulroney, on the one hand, he championed international human rights by opposing apartheid in South Africa, but his domestic policies failed to address systemic injustices, and that is particularly true for low-income Canadians and Indigenous Canadians. Because of this, there are questions about the Progressive Conservatives' approach to modern human rights issues. So we look at the party's emphasis on economic growth, limited government intervention, and privatization, and this conflicts with efforts to expand social protections, which leaves marginalized groups of Canadians more vulnerable. So what are those current human rights challenges here in Canada? And these are true again worldwide. First of all, there are systemic inequalities that disproportionately, as I said, impact marginalized groups. So, Indigenous peoples continue to struggle with inadequate access to things such as basic, clean water, housing, healthcare. And this is despite decades of continued promises from our governments. Women face persistent barriers to equality, including wage gaps, limited access to affordable childcare, and a lack of sufficient protections against gender based violence. As people with disabilities, we face significant systemic challenges again, such as barriers to employment, inaccessible infrastructure, and inadequate supports. So, on the one hand, Canada has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but the implementation of that, it continues to be inconsistent with huge gaps, and it leaves many persons with disabilities without the resources they need to live with autonomy and dignity. Immigrants and refugees coming to Canada face hurdles in accessing basic services and integrating into Canadian society. And this is particularly as anti-immigration sentiments gain traction with our more right-wing individuals. LGBTQ plus individuals, despite progress in areas like marriage equality, still face discrimination and violence. And this is, again, especially true in more conservative environments. So let's look at potential policy changes and their impact on human rights based on the likelihood that we will have this conservative government. First of all, Indigenous rights. The fact is, the progressive conservatives would inherit the challenge, a pressing challenge of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, which is a cornerstone of Canada's human rights agenda. However, the party historically has aligned with resource development projects, and this raises concerns about potential conflicts with Indigenous land rights and sovereignty. The conservative policies frequently prioritize economic growth through resource extraction. This is very common in Canada. And this includes things like pipelines and mining, which here in Alberta we're painfully aware of. And it frequently encroaches on Indigenous territories. There is a great risk under conservative government that reconciliation efforts will stall, and that this is particularly true. Financial commitments to address issues like clean drinking water and housing are deprioritized in favor of austerity. Indigenous communities may also face increased marginalization if the government rolls back protections for the lands or fails to uphold treaty obligations. There are also concerns for immigrant and refugee individuals who are depending on policy growth. Now, the conservatives' emphasis on security and economic growth could actually lead to greater or stricter immigration policies, which would reduce refugee acceptance rates and limit pathways to permanent residency. These measures would disproportionately impact vulnerable populations, including those fleeing persecution and violence. These stricter immigration policies could hinder family reunification, exacerbating emotional and financial hardships for immigrants. A reduced focus on multiculturalism and inclusion could further marginalize immigrant communities, fueling xenophobia and discrimination. And we are already seeing that in Canada. We are seeing changes in attitude and behavior that seem to target individuals who have emigrated to Canada or who are fleeing violence and danger in other countries. There are also issues for healthcare and social services. Uh, we have a universal healthcare system here in Canada, and it's one of our cornerstones of our commitment to human rights, but it could face significant challenges under conservative government because of the policy, the party's policy of fiscal restraint. Privatization may lead to reduced funding for healthcare, and it disproportionately again affects low income and marginalized communities in Canada. So this could exacerbate wait times, which, as we know, are already extreme. It could increase out of pocket expenses for Canadians and for persons with disabilities. Many of us who rely on specialized healthcare services, we would be particularly vulnerable, facing heightened barriers to receiving even basic care. There's also concerns about women's rights. Women could face setbacks in our basic rights, in particular in areas like reproductive health care and pay equity. Conservatives could push for restrictions on abortion access, and they're already talking about this. They could threaten women's autonomy over our bodies. So yes, our bodies, our choice. They could reduce funding for women's shelters and gender-based violence prevention programs, which would leave survivors and potential victims without basic critical support. Austerity measures could disproportionately impact sectors where women are overrepresented, such as healthcare and education, further entrenching gender inequity. Without proactive measures, these issues will affect particularly marginalized women, such as racialized communities and Indigenous women. And they would bear the brunt of the economic and social hardships. There are also issues that will affect LGBTQ plus persons. The rights, first of all, it should be noted that the rights of LGBTQ plus individuals are essentially enshrined in law in Canada, but those laws could face not only stagnation, but regression under the Conservatives. The socially conservative elements within the party may oppose new protections, such as banning conversion therapy or addressing gaps in health care for transgender individuals. And we already see with the very conservative, the United Conservative Party here in Alberta, horrible regression of basic equality, basic rights, basic health care for transgender children and youth. There's also an increased tolerance for socially conservative rhetoric, which could embolden discrimination and hate crimes against LGBTQ plus individuals. And this is particularly true in rural and very conservative areas. A failure to proactively combat such discrimination risks undermining the hard-won progress for our community in recent decades. Now, there's also basic rights for persons with disabilities. So we already face systemic barriers in employment, education, housing, and healthcare. With a conservative government, with its emphasis on reducing spending, could worsen these challenges by cutting funding for disability support programs and accessibility initiatives. Reduced investment in accessible infrastructure, assistive technologies, and inclusive education could further marginalize persons with disabilities. It would limit even more our ability to adapt and participate fully in society, and that is already an issue. Cuts to social assistance programs could leave individuals who are already vulnerable, who are already living in gross poverty, in an even more marginalized and vulnerable state. There are also environmental policies. So, a conservative government is very likely to prioritize uh, resource development over sustainability, which would exacerbate uh, environmental damage and injustices. Indigenous communities, rural populations, and low income Canadians will be disproportionately affected by climate change and will bear the brunt of these policies. There is a lack of commitment to climate action by the Conservatives, and this could undermine Canada's international human rights obligations. And this is particularly true for the right to a healthy environment. There are economic policies that lead to inequality. So, because of the goal of fiscal conservatism, which is like a hallmark of the Conservatives' uh, approach to things. They often talk about tax cuts, reduced government spending, and while they would stimulate economic growth, they will widen income inequality in Canada, and they will undermine social programs that help to keep people going. So this is like things like cuts to housing assistance, unemployment benefits, and other social safety nets that keep people alive. This could exacerbate poverty, leaving marginalized groups such as single mothers, low-income individuals, racialized communities, persons with disabilities, etc., without even basic support. Now, we know that the Conservative Party focuses on economic growth and fiscal responsibility. And so, yes, they potentially could create jobs and prosperity for a few people. But it's also important to know that they prioritize short term economic gains over long term equity and inclusion, which will leave many Canadians without even basic essential things like housing, food, um, heat. So without targeted investment in social programs and protections for vulnerable populations, these inequalities will broaden. So yes, I suppose that the Conservative Party could be seen to provide certain opportunities for a small group, but for many Canadians, the inequalities that we are already experiencing will broaden greatly. And I would encourage my fellow Canadians to think before you vote. Vote as you choose, but be educated about it. Learn what's really happening. And as I always do, I am providing links at the end. I really encourage you to look at what the Conservative Party is saying they're going to do, because some of it is very scary. And with that, I say, if you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe and like. Please share. Please comment. Again, keep the comments respectful. If you don't know Canadian law and experiences, please go to those links before you make a comment that might be perceived as less than pleasant. And don't assume, learn. Don't just take any party's information at face value. Actually go and do the research. And with that, I say to be senior is to be proud. Hugs.